Okay, good morning. I'm gonna do my my official interviewer voice. Okay, so my name is Andrea, and I'm a professor in the Faculty of Education at the University of Regina. And this morning, I'm talking with my friend and colleague, Russ Fayant, who is a faculty member in the Saskatchewan Urban Native Teacher Education Program, Regina. Russ is from the Capel Valley and now lives and works here in Regina. So good morning, Russ. And that was your cat, Norma, that was making a cameo in our conversation.
That is correct. Norma does what she wants to do, so you may see her a few times.
She's going to be a star.
She thinks whenever I'm talking on a phone or computer that I'm talking to her, so.
Okay, very good. Okay, so we're going to have a little conversation about an article that's in this in the Canadian Geographic magazine for September and October 2020. So if anything that we talk about is interesting, people can read that article at canadiangeographic.ca. It's written by Betty Ann McAdam. And the article is called Kagitwa Mepi Kiwitatak, Bringing It Back Home Again. And it's the story of how Michif, which is being called the critically endangered Indigenous language by the United Nations, it's the story of how it can be saved. And I like how it's phrased because it's not focusing on the impending death of a language. It's stating what is possible and the language can be saved. So maybe you can talk to me a bit about why it should be saved. What does the Michif language represent for you and for Michif peoples?
That's a really difficult question because I think it means something different to everybody. But I guess for me as an individual, Michif for me is the most authentic way to connect to who I am and my culture. So, I think that for all people who study languages, we know that you don't really understand a culture until you understand that language. And so even though I grew up in my culture, I didn't grow up speaking the language. And when I hear my old people speaking it, I feel as if I'm missing out on a piece of understanding of my culture. And so I often say to my students, I don't think I'll ever feel 100% Michif until I speak the language. So personally, that's what it means to me is to be able to fully reclaim my identity. I think on a more macro level, I've studied Michif for a long time, and for me, Michif really is one of the best models that we have in Canada for reconciliation. I think that we stumble through the night constantly, trying to find successful models for reconciliation, which we know is not doing well, and we know that from stories like the Mi'kmaq fishermen and all sorts of things that are happening in Canada, that reconciliation is not going well. But I think what we have in Michif is you have a language that equally incorporates French and Cree, or a European and Indigenous language, verbs, nouns, grammar, and understanding embedded within all of that. And so when you speak Michif, you are speaking from the context of two worldviews. And I think that's really what reconciliation is supposed to be. It's supposed to be that we understand each other's worldviews on an intimate level. And so I think that while it's probably not possible for all Canadians to learn Michif, I think that we can look at Michif as a real successful model of understanding one another. And if we lose that, then we've really lost a road path to reconciliation, I think.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay, so I want to talk to you a little bit about the article. The article provides like a really nice overview of the history of Michif peoples. It also tells us a lot about the different efforts that are taking place because Michif people are working, what I got from the article is people are working so hard to make sure that this language has vitality and continues and is a language not just of recordings, but a language that people are using. And I'm struck by all the different approaches that the communities and the people are using, are trying to implement. And in the article, one Michif speaker named Louise Olkey, and I might have that pronunciation wrong, but she's from Isle Across. Originally, she grew up speaking her language, and she's talking about her experience of teaching, being a guest teacher of Michif in a Saskatoon elementary school for 8 weeks. And she says that the children in that school picked up words and phrases, but then she says the language should be taught consistently, not just for 8 weeks, and asks whether the children have learned language that can stay with them. So really what I see Louise talking about is she's contrasting models of language teaching. And she's contrasting the immersion model with, something that's sometimes called a drip feed model, where you learn a bit of a language, maybe an hour once or twice a week, and you spread that out over time. So in your program, Suntech Regina, you're talked about in the article as well. You describe the approach that you've created for Michif language revitalization with the student teachers who are in your program. And what I find interesting about your approach is you're kind of combining some aspects of both models. So your adult learners have that hour of foundation with the language each morning. They learn, and they have the ability with their, their meta-linguistic understanding of language that adults have to do that. And then the rest of the day, they're spent with fluent speakers and doing immersive approaches to language learning. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the reasons you have for designing the program in the way that you have, and maybe, just sort of tell us a little bit about the program. And then also, if you could talk to us a little bit about the differences you see in the language learning of the students. So you've had experience with language learning in that kind of grammar translation, drip feed approach in a classroom. And now you've seen language learning in this land-based immersion model. So I'm wondering if you could also talk to us a little bit about some of the language learning results that come out of a program that you designed.
Sure. So I guess essentially what I'm trying to do is bridge students who have exclusively a Western trained context of learning language, and that's, for most of them, that's English. I'm trying to bridge that with a group of people, the old ones, the speakers, who largely never went to school. Some of them went to school till about grade 6 or grade 7, but largely Michif is their first language, and they were never trained in Western education. And so they have completely different ways of learning and teaching. And so what I'm trying to do is bridge that gap between my younger students and the old student, or the old ones. I refer to my elders as the old ones, just as a side note, because many Métis old ones find that when they're described as being elders, the expectation is that they should be able to do First Nation ceremony, and many Métis people don't. Some do, but many don't. So the other reason is that in Michif, our word for old people is le vieux puis le vieil, old men and old women. And so literally translated, they are the old ones. So that's, you'll hear me refer to the old ones lots during this interview. When we started this, we started this journey, I guess we'll call it, about 6 years ago, when we, as a program, started to really ask ourselves, what were we going to lose if we lost Michif, and what role should we play in helping to revive Michif, being that SUNTEP is a program of the Gabriel Dumont Institute, which is the largest Métis-specific educational institute in Canada. And if they're not going to save the language, then who is? So we sort of took it upon ourselves to create the beginnings of a Michif program. And so that started the way most university classes start, with, proposal that was sent into the Faculty of Education. And we, with that came all of the constraints of classroom learning. And so I wouldn't say that we started with the intent of doing sort of a drip drop program. I would say we started with really good intentions. And so when we started teaching Michif in class 2 times a week for an hour and 15 minutes each time, with myself and an old speaker named Irma Klein, we tried very, very hard to make it as non-traditional as possible in regards to language learning. And so we didn't have workbooks. The students weren't doing any writing. We were doing lots of singing. We were playing lots of games. We were doing cooking with old ones, and all of that was being conducted in Michif. But of course, what we found was lots of different things. I mean, one of the things we found is that the old ones, although they didn't explicitly express it, they displayed a little bit of discomfort in terms of coming to a university and having to teach the language that they had learned so naturally at home in a classroom environment. So they struggled a bit with that. And so I observed that, some of the old ones that I know very well, they were quiet when they would come to the classroom, even though the expectation was that they were supposed to teach the language. And they would teach the language, but they weren't as gregarious as they usually were. And so I picked up on that pretty quick. The other thing that we picked up on pretty quick, and by we, I mean Irma and I, because Irma and I are constantly having discussions about how we can improve things. We picked up on the fact that while students were incredibly engaged in the class, outside of the class, they were using Michif very rarely, or if at all, it was just sort of to say hello to somebody in a hallway. And of course, that wasn't our intent. Our intent was that they would take what they learned in the classroom and use it as often as possible, whether they were in or outside of the classroom. And we weren't seeing that. So in order to sort of solve both of those issues of elder discomfort, but also our young ones not fully engaging with the language, we went back to the source of basically all of our knowledge when it comes to language development, which is our community. I know that there's lots of really, really smart Indigenous academics across the world that are doing language research, and I certainly read that research and inform myself of it. But the more I read those Indigenous academics, the more they were actually saying to me that we are not the solution to your problem. The community is the solution to your problem. And so we listened to that, and we went back to community members and speakers of the language and said, how did you learn the language? How would you like to see younger people learn the language? And the very first thing they all said to us was, get out of the classroom. That's not the way that we learned Michif. Michif was learned by doing everyday things like hunting, like doing the dishes, like gathering medicines. And so they told us that we needed to create an environment in which those things could be done, while still incorporating some of that Western knowledge, particularly around grammar, because students have a need and a desire to understand the nuts and bolts of the language. And I do as well as an instructor. So I don't want to drop the grammar completely, but they were telling us essentially we needed to get out of the university. So with that, we developed a 3-week camp that takes place at the Lebret Métis farm. Unfortunately, we didn't have it last year because it runs in May and June. And of course, we were in the thick of the pandemic, and we still are. But so we've only actually run the course once, and our plan is to run it for a second time this spring and summer. But what we found over the course of those 3 weeks were students were spending 6 hours a day with us. And then the last 3 nights of the camp, they actually slept out. And so they were at the camp 24/7 with the old ones. What we found were quite a lot of differences from the classroom-based experience. And so, I mean, first of all, the natural gregariousness of my people just shone when we were out there. I mean, they are in their element when they're outside, and particularly when they're at a place that's significant to Métis people, like the Lebret Métis farm. I mean, a whole different side to my people versus, asking them to come to the university. They were themselves, essentially, and that's what we wanted. And so it was interesting because the first few days they seemed rather reluctant to identify themselves as teachers, even though I had to keep explaining to them that they were the teachers. But that quickly fell away. There's something about being in an outdoor context, in a cultural context, that really very quickly solidifies relationships between language learners and speakers. And anybody who's ever done a language camp will tell you the same, that when you're forced to cook with somebody, when you're forced to, you know, sleep in a tent next to somebody, your relationships solidify pretty damn quickly. And that only helps the learning. It helps my students want to take risks more. Which is really important because for many of my students, they had never heard Michif growing up and they were terrified of it. And the first couple days, it was a challenge to get them to engage, but it was really the strong relationships they developed with the elders through that cultural context that allowed them to take really important risks. And I would say by day 3, you know, they were doing and saying things that you know we never would have seen in the classroom environment. So that aspect of risk taking, I think, is important in language learning. Um, in terms of the actual use of the language, I mean, you're at camp for 6 days, and the rule was that you couldn't speak English, so they really had no choice but to use it. So of course, we saw retention go way up. The amount of speaking that was happening was probably at least a tenfold increase of what we observed in the classroom. And so we would see things like during breaks, we would see students having little, you know, small conversations in Michif, or they would be approaching an old one on a break and trying out a new sentence that they had learned. So these were things that we didn't see at all in the classroom, because the classroom was very much, you know, a say and repeat sort of context, right? Where here at the camp, students were taking risks to create their own sentences and then to try and engage with elders in a very naturalized context. So I took a couple side tours on that question. So I hope I've answered most of it, but if I didn't, feel free to ask me a clarifying question, Andrew.
No, absolutely you did. I just have one last question. How did that make the elders feel? The old ones?
You know, I I get actually goosebumps when I think about that, because um, these are people who hold on to their language despite vast odds. These were people who were told not to speak their language in school. These were people who were made fun of for speaking their language, and to some extent are still made fun of because many of them still have accents. These were people who didn't teach their language to their children because they saw it as something that would hold their kids back in school. So they carried a lot of shame with the language, and they carried, even though they loved the language, they never stopped loving it. They did carry some shame with it. And so to hear and to see a bunch of 20-year-olds uh, fill up with pride to be able to say a sentence to them in their language, you just saw that pride in them grow. Um, and that's really what created the teachers in them, right? That's where the old ones went from being reluctant teachers to like almost going overboard with the students, like, hey, let me teach you this word. Hey, I didn't tell you this yesterday, let me tell you this. So I mean, that pride was transformational for both of the groups. And now I have this core group of speakers, of old ones, who are like a little community. They talk to each other, they talk to me, they talk about language. They're off doing workshops for different organizations now. These are things they never would have done 2 years ago. When they still thought that Michif was a language that needed to be, you know, kept under wraps, so to speak. It's the pride of the students has shown them that their language is valuable and worth learning, and it's awakened that in them. They always knew that, the old ones always knew that, but it had to be, sort of shaken out of them a little bit. And so now when they speak about, you know, like the old ones will go around saying, oh, I'm a teacher, I'm a professor now at the university, and I love that, because I think that if we're going to save this language, we don't have a lot of options in terms of people we can go to. There's one generation left that speaks the language, and it's that generation. And if we don't get them excited about language teaching, and if we don't build relationships with them that are authentic and reciprocal and respectful and ethical, then they're not going to want to work with us. And then what we're doing is reconstructing an inauthentic version of the language, and nobody wants to do that.
Okay, I could keep talking to you for hours about this, but I think I'll stop there. and maybe we'll do a repeat, a next chapter sometime. Okay, I'm going to stop recording if I can figure out how.
Maybe I can get Norma to be more lively next time.
She did well.